You're listening to the PooleProof Wisdom Podcast, where we bring our authentic selves, refuse to raise grown folks, and share wisdom you can use. With your host, Charles K. Poole.
Good morning, good people. You know what? I'm really having an it's a good day to have a good day moment. And I sure hope you're feeling the vibes too, because my guest today is bound to lay some knowledge on you that will help you appreciate what it means to be on a journey of your own while helping others in the process. Let me tell you a little bit about her. Nzinga Zing Shaw joined ZRG in 2021, serving as the first president of Turnkey ZRG, the sports and entertainment search firm acquired by ZRG in 2020. Additionally, she is the Managing Director, Chief Inclusion and Diversity Officer for Internal ZRG Talent and Global Head, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Practice. Now, Zing is an experienced C-Suite executive with extensive hands-on experience and knowledge spanning change and crisis management, human capital management, employee relations, talent acquisition, organizational and strategic planning, branding, community engagement, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. She is known for her pioneering diversity, equity, and inclusion work with the NBA's Atlanta Hawks, launching the Mosaic Symposium, Mosaic standing for Model of Shaping Atlanta Through Inclusive Conversations, and making the Hawks the first professional sports team to celebrate the LGBTQ community. Notably, Zing was the first inclusion and diversity officer at 4 blue-chip organizations: Edelman, Starbucks, Marsh McLennan, and the NBA. She has been recognized with numerous 40 Under 40 awards from the likes of Sports Business Journal, Atlanta Business Chronicle, The Network Journal, and PR Week. In addition to serving on the Board of Trustees of Fisk University, the Board of Directors of ColorCom, and the Board of Advisors of Arctos Sparks Partners, she was also appointed by President Jimmy Carter to serve a 6-year term on the Board of Counselors of the Carter Center. Zing received her MLA from the University of Pennsylvania and her BA from Spelman College. She was a study abroad scholar at Oxford. In her free time, what little there is of it based on her very full schedule, Zing enjoys interior design, international travel, cooking, and spending time with her husband Keith and 3 children, Lacey, Hudson, and Trey, all of whom I guarantee you are absolutely adorable. I titled this episode, Ain't I a Woman? Women in the C-Suite and Trailblazing for DEI, because Zing is truly a worthy inheritor of the message and meaning behind Sojourner Truth's iconic 1851 speech to the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, in particular as it relates to this line. Quote, "If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it. The men better let 'em." It's a wonderful statement, and indeed, Zing is turning the world right side up, y'all. A successful executive, wife, mother, and advocate for diversity who represents the growth of women executives in the workplace and the impact they're having not only in that space, but in the social and political spaces as well. Hers is a journey we can all learn from and be inspired by. So, let's get after it. Good morning, Zing. Thank you for joining the podcast. I'm so glad to see you.
Thank you, Charles. I'm so excited to be here with you. Thank you for inviting me.
You know, it's been a long time. You and I first connected years ago where there was some job at Edelman or something I'd applied for, and I ended up talking to you, and we just had a rapport, and so we somehow ended up staying in contact. true evidence of some people are in your life for a season and some people are in your life for a reason. I'm so glad you're one of them. And over the years, even though we've never physically met, but we've just had this connection, I have been watching what you have done. Couldn't be prouder if you were my sister, okay? Because it's so wonderful to see people on a journey that is revealing to them even things capable that they're capable of, I should say, that they didn't even imagine. And when I go back to that initial time that I was talking to you all those years ago, tell me something about the journey that you thought you were on and the journey that you have discovered yourself to be on instead.
I love that question. And you're absolutely right. Before I jump in that, reason and season, but I think there's also lifetime, right? Some people are meant to be in your life forever. And that's how I think of you. And so you have also inspired me. I've watched you as well, and I'm just grateful to be in community with you.
Thank you.
But in terms of when you and I met, that was over 10 years ago, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And the journey that I was on at that time was breaking into diversity, equity, and inclusion as a practitioner. Edelman was the first place that I formally did the work. And so I thought I was on a journey of leading DE&I for a PR agency and perhaps touching people's lives in a way that that they haven't been touched before. But the journey that I have been on over the past decade has been certainly amazing. But there has been tumultuous times during the journey that I've been on. And I realized that back then, that young lady who was bright-eyed and optimistic and believed in everything good in the world, as I started to go down the path of learning more and more about diversity, equity, and inclusion and how it shows up in organizations, I think I am now approaching the work from a more realistic point of view. So I've been a chief diversity officer 4 times at 4 blue chip organizations since you and I have met. Edelman as my first start, then the National Basketball Association, where I became the first chief diversity officer, Starbucks, also their first chief diversity officer, and then Marsh McLennan, their first chief diversity officer. So 4 times as a first in blue chip organizations that have expressed a desire to want to change. But what I've learned along the journey is that change is, it's hard. And when you're used to operating a certain way, particularly if you're in the majority and you have been afforded certain privileges, it's hard to let that go. And sometimes there is a resistance to the work and a resistance to behavioral changes. And so I now approach my work a lot more realistically. I have abandoned becoming a chief diversity officer inside of an organization. That is not the path for me anymore, because what I've learned along the way is that you really need to be concerned about outcomes when you're doing this work. And so outcomes for me look like people of color, women, people that are LGBTQ in large positions, in big organizations, impacting the bottom line, having real power in an organization and even on corporate boards. And so for me, I have pivoted my career to leading an executive search firm, because that is really how you get diversity, equity, and inclusion done. When I have clients and they say, we have this very big C-suite role, whether it's a CEO or a CMO or chief operating officer, and the list goes on. And then they say, we need to hire someone that is going to be innovative and bring change to our organization and help us think differently. If I can connect them with people who are traditionally on the margins, but very talented, that is really how you move the needle of diversity, equity, and inclusion in organizations. In my opinion, it is not by sitting in a chief diversity officer role inside of one organization trying to change people that perhaps don't want to change.
It's an interesting dynamic for me because obviously you're a woman, okay? And those things I think often become part and participle of why people decide that there's something to fight for. As I referenced in the title of what I'm calling this session, I referenced the Sojourner Truth, speech from the convention she did in, I think, 1851, 61, Ain't I a Woman? Because in that speech, she references the fact that, men have turned the world upside down and women are going to be the ones who turn it right side up again. And I really feel that that's the journey that you have been on, because you are a fighter, that's obvious, but you also are a consummate believer in that equity and that inclusion and that diversity. And as a woman who has been many, many first, how do you use that point of view to fuel your passion about what you do? Because there's the work and then there's the passion behind it. Explain that to me.
Yeah, I mean, passion comes deep within. Passion is not something that you can learn in school. And I have been educated in a lot of great places. I went to a historically Black college as an undergrad, Spelman in Atlanta, Georgia. I went to the University of Pennsylvania for my master's degree, and I studied abroad at Oxford University in the UK.
Right.
But none of those places, they taught me great lessons around theoretical opportunities in academia. But I did not learn passion in school. Passion came from experiences in my life where I have had either deep joy or deep pain. And so feeling those emotions and tying them to whatever demographic set that I am representing. So my gender at certain times when I've been mistreated at work because of it. I can recall 3 times when I was mistreated for being pregnant in the workplace. I have 3 children.
Wow.
And each time it was not a good experience. There are times that my race makes me passionate because I see the turmoil and the strife that Black and brown people have to endure, not only in the broader world, but particularly in corporate environments. And so because I embody these things, it makes me feel closely connected to the journey and the struggles that these people go through. And it makes me want to fight for them. It makes me want to fight for myself. I'll give you a very quick story. My uncle, Dexter, he passed away when I was 14 years old, and he had cancer. He was young, he was 33 years old. And so I remember 5 years after his death, at my graduation from college, it's actually 7 years later, I said to one of my cousins, I said, I wish Uncle Dexter was here with us. And she said, yeah, it's a shame how he passed away so early. And I said, I know. How can a young person get cancer? And she looked at me and she said, cancer? Uncle Dexter didn't have cancer. Uncle Dexter had AIDS. Right. And so I was kind of quiet and paused and reflective. And then she continued to tell me that he was a part of the LGBTQ community and lived most of his life in silence, in fear, closeted, and all of these things because of I would say the mindsets of people in my family and the mindsets of people around him. He felt like he had to be quiet and not live out loud. And that for me was the moment when I realized that I was going to be a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner, because I never wanted anyone to feel like they couldn't show up in this world and be authentically them. And so that was the moment where I said, I don't know how, I didn't know if it was a DEI officer because there was no such thing at the time, but I knew I wanted to use my skill set and my passion to help change and to be a voice for the voiceless. So yeah, that's where the passion comes from.
And, it's an interesting thing to me hearing that, because in the roles that you've had and obviously what you're doing right now, people think of these terms DEI and they see a very limited scope, right? But, I've heard this line, obviously Issa Rae uses all the time, I'm pulling for Black people. But that is possible because what people like you are doing, people like her for that matter, they're literally pulling for everybody, but given unique circumstances, there are certain things that they're pulling for these groups that we're talking about that are necessary because no one else is doing the pulling for them. And I think that's the big misunderstanding about what it means to support these types of efforts. It's as if supporting people who need these things is excluding everybody else, when in fact, it's welcoming them to join in the process. Is that an accurate assessment?
It's an accurate assessment for sure. And it is I would say, a deep misunderstanding of DE&I executives and experts. I just had this conversation with a colleague recently. It was a white colleague who said, I love what you're doing. I love, these business resource groups that you're setting up, but I don't fit into any of them. I'm not a woman, so that group doesn't apply to me. I'm not multicultural, so that group doesn't apply to me. And I'm not LGBTQ, so that group doesn't apply to me. So where do I fit in? And I said to him, I said, well, you're a white man. I said, that means you fit into all of this because you are a part of the power structure. You are a part of the demographic of people who are oftentimes the decision makers and oftentimes the people who are the connective tissue between talent and who can actually permeate the glass ceiling.
Right.
And so you need to be a part of these groups for a couple of reasons. Number one, there's deep learning within these institutions. And so if there are things that you are not aware of about what these groups are going through or even how they should be leveraged, that's one reason for you to join. And another reason for you to join is to show your allyship and to demonstrate that you are here walking alongside your colleagues and you want to ensure that they are having an equitable experience. So I oftentimes hear people say, well, if I'm not a part of the group, how can I help? And for me, you can help in major ways if you're not a part of the group.
It's a mind shift because anybody who gets on in this world, I think, has to begin from a basis of, okay, we're all humans. If we begin there, and then we look at the unique circumstances of our own individual humanity, we are opened up to seeing new and different things. I was a little bit smiling when you were talking about your educational background because you're kind of a genius, but I know you won't say that, but I just did. But you're very bright, and when you mentioned Spelman is the best of the best for an HBCU and for women in particular. My experience was a little bit different when I was going to high school. Back in the Jurassic age. I'm saying that again. I actually grew up in it wasn't unique for the time. All of the schools I went to were filled with Black people. Teachers, administrators, all the stores in the neighborhood were. Everybody that I saw looked exactly like me, except the people on TV. So when it was time to go to college, my counselor was actually trying to get me to go to her alma mater, which was an HBCU. And I just didn't feel, given the experience I had, that I was going to learn anything. And what she probably thought was flippant, but was simply me being open to a new experience. I told her, I said, I've seen a lot of Black people. I need to see somebody else because I needed to broaden my horizons. And Zing, the reason I raised that is I don't claim to know everything about every Black person because, as we know, it's not monolithic, the Black community. But I knew that I didn't know anything about anything else. And one of the first indicators of that, when I went to the school I did, excuse me, which was down the street from my high school, St. Louis University, I'd never met a Catholic person, had no idea what freaking Ash Wednesday was. And a woman who was dean of students at the time, there was a big bank on the corner, and I was coming out, and she was going in, and she had what appeared to me to be dirt on her forehead. And I went to wipe it off. She was like, no, don't do that. And I said, you have dirt on your head. And she says, no, Charles. She says, it's Ash Wednesday. And I said, what's that? And that was to illustrate things that opened up my world so I learned more about what other people are doing, what other people are thinking, and I've continued to do that. And the point that you made about the guy that you were talking about, it's about that willingness to say, I know what I don't know, and I need to learn it. And until they open themselves up to that perspective, all they're doing is walking around blaming everybody else for the fact that they're different without trying to understand what those differences mean. Is that something that you encounter on a regular basis?
Absolutely. I encounter it all the time. First I want to address what you were talking about as it relates to HBCUs. I feel very passionate
Right.
about people of color, particularly Black people, attending these institutions as undergrads. For me, I grew up around Black people as well. I grew up in New York, a very multicultural place. And so there were a lot of types of people, but certainly had access to Black
Right.
people. But the reason that I chose to go to an HBCU was for a few reasons. Number one, you have to really have a deep understanding of self and the history of your lineage before you can be a contributor in a broader society. And I knew that HBCUs were strategically situated to teach lessons about the Black experience back to the diaspora from, many centuries ago. So not starting with our history in the United States as enslaved people, but when we were kings and queens on the continent of Africa. I needed to hear that. I needed to understand that. And I also needed to be around a variety of Black people to teach that exact lesson that you described, which is that we are not a monolith.
Right.
And so when I went to Spelman, I met young ladies that were from California, and they were very different than me from New York. I met people from Ghana. I met people from Bermuda. I met people from all over the diaspora. And so visually we looked the same, but in terms of our lived experiences, we were extremely different. And so that was very important because that institution instilled a lot of confidence in me.
Sure.
Because I heard about all of the wonderful things that Black people did and that we were not always slaves. We were, oftentimes kings and queens and in charge of huge kingdoms. And so when I went to the University of Pennsylvania, a predominantly white institution, I was confident. And although I would be oftentimes the only Black person in my classroom, I felt like I had a voice and that my voice should be utilized and that I could speak in front of any audience and not worry about who was looking at me or what people thought. And that confidence came from my HBCU background. So that's just a little bit of, background into why I chose those institutions at those times in my life.
No, I think it's a wonderful thing. And, I think we should actually probably do some type of historical case study because no kidding, I am significantly older than you. So that being said, those people that you're talking about, like at the HBCU, I felt that I grew up with those people, even in my elementary and high schools, but it was a different time. These were people who were coming up and had all of this opportunity to make sure that those things were taught. So I totally agree that that's an essential thing. And I will tell you, it's an interesting thing lately as I've looked at, some of them are older programs, but, like when I used to look at A Different World, I was like, man, that's kind of cool. I wish I'd had that experience. Or like the show on Netflix, Dear White People, I was like, I would like to have that experience. But I do believe that the importance of the ancestry, the knowledge of the history, was something that I was able to get because the people who were around me were giving me that. And I'm so glad that you brought up the point about HBCUs because in doing so, you have dispelled what people think they are. And I think that that's an important thing because for people who don't know what an HBCU does, they just think, well, historically Black college or university. And that's all that they focus on, the word Black and, historically. And it's about helping anyone who needs it to form their identity, which is what you got from it. So,
absolutely.
Right? Because
we also have to remember HBCUs were established because white institutions would not allow Black people to study in their schools. We weren't allowed to go to college. And so we had to establish our own institutions and educate ourselves. So we have to really understand the deep history of these institutions before dispelling them as being exclusive and only available to Black students. There's a reason that that is the case.
Well, and going back to that thing about people not knowing what they don't know, I don't even want to ask how many times you've had to deal with this, but whether it's an institution or an event or a group, it's like, well, why do you have to have your own? I was like, because y'all wouldn't let us in. Y'all never wanted us. You didn't let us in. What were we supposed to do? Just go away? We created our own stuff. And I think that that's still a powerful statement for many of the organizations that still exist today. And I think that it helps individuals, again, figure out who they are, because when everybody is telling you that you're less than, that becomes your narrative if you don't know anything different, if you don't see anything different. It's, as I think I've said in another podcast before, the reason I like the 100 Black Men philosophy, which is what they see they will be. I totally get that. But that's not to the exclusion of everybody else. I mean, we live in this country, we live in this world, so of course we're going to interact with other people. I think it's difficult for people to understand why it's so important for us to be self-aware, to be self-confident, to know what our value is, because if someone else wants to set that for you and you're not going to allow them, that's about them being uncomfortable. It's not about us taking anything away. And that's the implicit message of what I think that your example and your work continues to promote is inclusivity is really inclusive, except for those who want things to stay exactly as they are. Right?
That's absolutely correct. And so the only way that you really get to achieve the true goal of an inclusive environment or true inclusion is to do one of two things. Mm-hmm. You either have to change the people or you have to change the people. Mm-hmm. What do I mean by that?
Right.
Change the people. You have to change their behaviors, their heart, their mindsets, through education, through exposure, by giving them tools. But if they refuse to change those old behaviors that have kept organizations stagnant and have kept organizations exclusive, then you have to change the people. You have to get rid of them.
Right, right. Yeah.
And that is what organizations fail to do. They fail to change the people when the people don't change.
This is why I get to say, preach. You are telling the truth right there, because that continuation is born out of fear, as if being collectively embracing of all that is human, all that is unique and individual in the human span and space, somehow weakens one. I will never wrap my brain around it, Zing, as long as I live, because if I'd let the fact that certain people behave in certain ways define my individual journey, I think of all the people I would never have known, all the people I would never have been able to benefit from the wisdom of and the experience of. And I literally, the way I tell people, I say, I love everybody until they give me a reason not to. And that for me, excuse me, that for me means enter the situation with an open mind and an open heart. Is that what you're teaching people? Good. So in doing that, how are you able to transition now? I'm going to make a big transition. You are this senior executive who is running things, a boss. And in your own organization, you have this opportunity to not just react to things, but to set the stage. How do you do that when you're working with your clients? How do you do that when you're working with your team?
I'm sorry, you cut out for 1 second.
Oh, sure.
I didn't.
Sure. I'm saying that in this role that you now have, how are you helping your clients to understand the efficacy of working to achieve mutual goals by embracing their humanity, by embracing the individuality and the collective abilities of everyone to contribute to the human condition versus just, you know, this is this group that's in power, this is that group that's in power? How are you doing that with your clients and with your team?
I love that question because I believe that there has to be concurrent learning while you're doing work.
Right.
And so oftentimes what happens with executives is that, especially in the business that I'm in, executive recruiting, your clients drive all of your activity and there's rarely pushback or education along the way. And so I like to approach the work very differently. I like to let my clients know from the very beginning that we are going on a learning journey with one another as we hope to, secure a new executive in whatever position that they're looking for. And so the way that I've set up my practice is to ensure that I also offer consulting services around diversity, equity, and inclusion and learning. and not just, training in the formal sense of unconscious bias training, but I'm talking about real deep assessments to figure out what are we doing that is being exclusive, right? So sometimes when you're diagnosing clients and helping them with their issues, you actually have to concentrate on what's wrong versus what's right. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. So when a person goes to the doctor, let's say they haven't been to the doctor in a long time, the doctor will likely give them a questionnaire and ask them about what's ailing them. What doesn't feel good? What, does your head hurt? Are you sleeping at night? If you're not sleeping, what are some of the activities that are taking place that you think might contribute to that? So there's just a lot of questions. Does your foot hurt? Does your back hurt? The reason that doctors provide those type of assessments and they ask those type of questions is because they're trying to diagnose your ailment based on what is hurting, what is not good, what is not feeling right. When organizations approach diversity, equity, inclusion, they actually do the opposite, which never gets to the cure. So what they do is they send out assessments, engagement assessments to employees, and they ask a majority culture, do you like working here? Does your manager support you? Do you feel like you have a voice?
Right.
And so if you know that 70% of your population happens to be one thing, whatever that one thing is, and you're asking questions about positive experiences, you're going to get 70% of the people saying, yes, my manager supports me. Yes, I enjoy the culture. Yes, I would recommend this as a good place to work.
Right.
But really what you need to be doing is focusing on that 30% that are having bad experiences to find out where is the ailment, where is the pain coming from. And then that's how you're going to be able to diagnose what the problem is and fix it. So when I deal with my clients, that's real. I try to figure out who's on the margins in this organization, what experiences are they having, and then I can come with real solutions for what might be troubling the company and what type of practitioners they may need to include in their organization to push to the next level.
I would imagine that there is, at least for a short time, a little bit of an intimidation factor with your clients when they have to come to terms with Zing Shaw. Number one, you are industry recognized for what you have been capable of doing. You have shown the value of pushing the needle. In every place you've gone, you've left an imprint. Do you still find that despite all of that, all of the evidence that says, and I know that you wouldn't say it this way, this is the way I'm saying it, but it's like saying, look, I know what I'm doing here. You really should listen to me. Do you find that that is still a rough road to hoe with clients? Or because of the evidence, are they more inclined to say, I need to listen to you. Please be sure to let me know if I'm not giving you the appropriate attention and feedback that you need?
I would say that clients actually lean into my advice and they want help. If they're willing to spend thousands of dollars for consultations and for assessments and for recruiting help, they're at the point where they have come to terms with things are not great. I would say the pushback is from internal colleagues. That's really where I find most of the pushback. And, and it's always someone who says, my heart is in the right place. I'm a good person. I really want to see this work. And I always, my counter offer to that feedback is, you don't have to tell me about your intentions. You have to show me your intentions. So I rarely listen to people's words. I oftentimes watch their behavior and actions. And, so I would say clients, when they get to the point where they want counsel, they're not pushing back. They know things are bad, but it's the colleagues who often push back and they want you to know that they're good people.
Yeah, well, and I'm wishing I was taller, but some things just won't ever happen. So we have to keep those things in mind. Zing, I want to make a little bit of a shift now. You are a mother of three who, is raising the future. I mean, let's call it what it is. Knowing what you know, being involved in the industry that you're in.
Mhm.
What role does that play in your mothering? I know that's a big question, but I know that you are a deep thinker and that this is something as a mother you think about probably every day. How does that play, though, into raising your kids so that they can be what they want to be? But in this world where
I love that
yeah,
question. I
but in
love
this,
that question
yeah,
because it influences every single thing that I do for and with my children.
mm-hmm,
Um, I'm raising Black children in
right,
America,
mm-hmm,
and I have two boys,
mm-hmm,
which is very different than raising a girl, I think.
mm,
I think that the world is harder on Black boys than it is on Black girls. And
mm,
so I am very aware and cognizant of the challenges that they will face. And so it starts early, even with their education. As young as my kids are, I'm up at the school. I'm talking to these teachers. I want to know, how are you challenging my children? What are the areas that they need to focus on at home with me when they are not in school with you in
mm,
terms of their lessons? I also want to know, my kids are in majority white schools right now. And so I also want to know about how they are infusing a curriculum of inclusion
mm,
and what type of practitioners and teachers are around my children,
mm,
what type of students, what are the interactions. So I'm very, I would say, overly present
mm,
in terms of their education,
mm,
but I don't rely on education as the only way to mother my children. And
right,
so we do a lot of community service. I
mm,
take my kids to homeless shelters often so that we can feed people,
right,
so that we can give gifts and clothing
mm-hmm.
to the
That's
mothers and the
wonderful.
children that are in these institutions. And I remember right before Christmas, I took my kids, I posted it on LinkedIn, a picture of me and my family giving some toys to children that were at a homeless shelter here in
Mm-hmm.
Atlanta. And my daughter asked me, she said, "Mommy, why do they all sleep in the same bedroom? How
Mm,
come they don't have their own bedroom?"
right,
And I said to her, I said, "Because you are very fortunate. You're a
mm-hmm,
blessed young lady.
mm-hmm,
There are a lot of kids that don't have a bedroom. Some kids don't even have a mommy
right,
or a daddy, and they're in foster care." So just
mm-hmm,
slowly trying to teach them that they are blessed in many ways,
mm-hmm,
but that they have to show up excellently in anything that they do. Right now,
mm-hmm,
we're trying out a lot of different things. I don't want to lead them down the path of basketball or down the path of
right,
soccer or
right,
piano or
mm-hmm,
things that I did.
mm-hmm,
I want them to try everything and
mm-hmm,
then say, "I really like this. This
mm-hmm,
resonates. This
mm-hmm,
sticks." Well, I'm just teaching them to be good, to do good in the world. Do good by others,
mm-hmm,
and do good for yourself. Show up excellently in everything that you do. It doesn't matter what path you go down. Just make sure you're giving it 100% and that you are giving back.
mm-hmm,
Right. So when my kids have a huge playroom in our house and it's
mm-hmm,
filled with toys, and every single time my daughter says, "I want a new toy," I said, "Which one are you giving me?
mm-hmm,
You have to give me a toy if you're going to get a toy, because
mm-hmm,
we're going to take whatever you give me to
right,
these children at these shelters."
yeah,
So now they're understanding the concept of, I don't just get things because I want them.
mm-hmm,
I have to give back.
mm-hmm,
And that is something that I'm trying to instill in them also. And I'm trying to instill empathy in my
mm-hmm,
children. I
mm-hmm,
want them to be empathetic
mm-hmm.
and understand that they have a responsibility to help others.
So when, because it's that essential question. When I had Damon Jones from Procter and Gamble on, I talked about how I loved all of their social activism types of commercials and messaging, and we were talking about the one called The Talk, right? As a mother, when does that come into play? Because they seem really young now, but they're also very, bright and precocious. Is that something you and the hubs have talked about? And from your perspective, when do you, in balancing that with everything else that you're teaching them, give them that, I hate to use this phrase, but it seems appropriate, that fair warning of this reality that they may have to come into contact with?
Charles, it's such an interesting question that you ask because my kids are young, but I've started talking to them about microaggressions
Mm,
because we've been in situations where they have experienced me have microaggressive activity and behaviors targeted towards me in public settings. And so my daughter, I remember distinctly a couple of months ago, asked me, why is that lady being rude to you and talking to you that way? And then I had to, and she's 5, right? So,
Right.
you know, as a parent, you always want to shelter your children from the harsh realities of racism and sexism and ageism and all of these isms. But at some point, you can't shelter them. And so slowly, I am starting to have the talk with her, not my boys yet, they're too little, but I'm starting to have the talk with her because she's also experienced some bad behavior on the playground from some of her white counterparts, and they're being raised by the parents who are doing these microaggressive activities. And so you can only imagine how that translates to how children behave with one another and at school. And so it's hard, Charles, because I'm trying to shelter them as much as I can, but I have to face the day when these things will happen to them, and I have to prepare them.
Right.
And they have to be ready to take whatever comes their way.
And I do think that that deserves some applause, because in doing so, it's not that you will necessarily help them escape it, but you are making them resilient little spirits who can face what they have to face and not be broken by it, because that's the real test, isn't it? Is what happens to you. I had done something some time ago, and I was talking about the book that was out, where people often look at individuals they come across and they were like, well, what's wrong with you? But the appropriate question is, what happened to you? And these types of behaviors taken and dealt with early on without some ability to understand them contextually and to individually understand, this is not who I am, so I don't know who they're talking about. It can lead to a lot of trauma later on. So I applaud you for taking these steps, because too many people think that it's not something you do because you're stealing their childhood, when in fact, you're helping them in childhood become who they will eventually be. So bravo. I think that's the smartest move you can make, because the world is the world, not what we hope for, but what we deal with.
That's right. Dr. King has this wonderful quote that he used, and I love it. And it applies to exactly what you're describing. He said, the same boiling water that can make an egg hard is the same boiling water that can make a potato soft. It is not about your circumstances. It's about how you react to them.
Oh, gosh, that is so perfect. And you're teaching them to react with individual self-awareness over time. I think that if you had gotten a chance to meet my mom, you would have liked her. She is of the same ilk. No nonsense, but as loving as anyone can possibly be, but always dealing in the truth to help her children become the manifestation of things that in her growing up, she was born in 1937. So in the time that she was growing up, you know, she would have been 85. Actually, this coming Monday is her birthday, the 17th. Same as Betty White and Michelle Obama. There you go. Two good Capricorns. But she taught us the individual power of self-awareness. And I'm applauding you for doing that with your children. And I want to make another transition now. You know, mother, we've talked about that, but you're also in this role, boss lady, where you are a woman among many, many men in the industry that you're in. How do you stand firmly in that by not being defined by what anyone else's perception of what being a woman means, and letting yourself purely and authentically shine through?
You know, I've been in the sports and entertainment industry for a long time, and I deal in professional male sports. So not the WNBA, but the NBA and, you know, the NFL and Major League Baseball. And so I have been in these predominantly male spaces for a long time. The way that I deal with it is to bring really, really good and innovative ideas to the table that they don't think about. Because I think ideas win in an environment like that. If you can up-level what's happening and introduce your counterparts to something that is going to change the game, no pun intended, then that's how you gain credibility. And so oftentimes I think that in these spaces, men, they talk over women, they're loud, particularly in sports and entertainment. They can be very A-type personalities, aggressive. A lot of my colleagues and past colleagues are ex-professional athletes, and so they're competitive. So all of that energy comes to the table. And so if you're a woman in that environment, you have to feel self-assured and bring good ideas to the table, because undoubtedly they are not thinking about something that you are thinking about. And I can give you an example. When I started my role with the Atlanta Hawks as their chief diversity officer, we were planning a big celebration to unveil a statue of Dominique Wilkins in front of the arena. And it was a big deal because we don't have any statues in front of the arena at the time. It's like the Lakers, I think they have 5 or 6 statues in front of their arena. This is something that they do. This would have been our first. And so it was a big deal. How are we going to unveil this, and who's going to be at the table? And so I remember sitting in a room with a bunch of my male colleagues, and we were talking about the actual celebration and what it would look like. And so we were talking about who would speak on behalf of Dominique, and so there were ideas being thrown around the table. Well, let's talk to his high school coach. Let's talk to his college coach. Let's talk to the players that he played with, Charles Barkley and Michael Jordan and all of these people. And I just remember sitting back, and after everyone was done, I said, there were a lot of women that helped shape Dominique's life, including his mother, who's still living, his wife, his sisters, his daughters. Are there women that we can include in this conversation? And everyone just paused, Charles. They kind of like paused.
Wow.
And then my boss, who was the CEO of the team at the time, he looked at me and he said, "That's a genius idea." And I thought to myself, no, it's really not genius. It's just common sense.
That's right.
But things like that, I think just bringing an out-of-the-box idea to the table in a male environment is what will gain credibility over time.
That story reminds me, even though we won't talk about the male lead, but that movie, What Women Want, and there was this, supposed issue with them having this Nike account, and it was a woman's voice that helped to define what it really meant for women in playing sports. And I'll never forget, they came up with, this tagline, Nike, no games, just sports. But they were showing women participating in it. And that common sense approach that you just described, the fact that you're in a room full of people and not one of them even thought about that.
And I'm talking about senior level executives. I'm not talking about people who are new to the workplace and, perhaps evolving. No, I'm talking about see this and see that and big titles.
Yeah. So being in the C-suite, is assertiveness a benefit or a disadvantage for a woman?
It depends on the woman.
Oh, now that's
I think that white women who are assertive are seen like they're perceived to be big bosses, and oh wow, she's courageous and she takes bets and she can do the job and she's got the chops. And I think that when Black women are assertive, at least in my experience, she is aggressive and mean-spirited and perhaps not cut out for this environment and all of these other things. So I think race trumps gender in these instances. And it really just depends on the variables that are included.
When you come across that type of experience on a repeated basis, and I'm speaking personally here as well, there's an option for us. And I know the answer for you already because we're having this conversation. You're still doing things on a much different level. But, there's that old saying that when you have experiences, you can get bitter or you can get better. For those who are like you, who get better, what is the formula, if there is one, that helps you to look at everything that's going on and not to be disgusted by it, but instead to be inspired to find other ways to affect change?
It's a great question. I think for me, over time, and as I have spent more and more time on this planet, I have been able to manage my emotions. I think when I was younger, I took things very personally and they deeply hurt me and impacted me. And so it almost was very crippling in many ways because I couldn't get past what was happening in the immediate moment. Over time, I have learned to look at the big picture. And so I've defined early on, what am I trying to solve in this moment? What does the end goal look like? And so when these situations occur and you have these players who perhaps are misbehaving or, trying to create tension so that it's harder for the work to get done, I realize that this is temporary. My mom used to say, this too shall pass.
That's right.
And I've really learned to digest those words and put them into action more so now than I ever have before. I think also becoming a mom has taught me how to be more, I would say, patient and deal in chaos. Just deal with chaotic situations that perhaps I can control or perhaps I cannot control, knowing that these children have to be taken care of no matter what. And so it's the same thing. I approach the same work the same way. There will be chaos.
Right.
There will be dissenters. There will be people that are not aligned, but I can't let them get me off task. So as long as I have defined the goal, that is what I work towards. I work towards the goal. It's like a hurdler. Lolo Jones, I used to love watching her run. She's just a phenomenal hurdler. And I remember when she ran in the Olympics and she was favored to be the gold medalist and got all the way to the finals and tripped over the last hurdle. And it was devastating for the track community. Sure. But when she was interviewed, she said, they call them the hurdles because you have to get over them.
Wow.
And so I think about those, that same line in corporate America. There are things that we're just going to have to jump over and get past. And if you trip and fall, you got to get up and keep going.
I love that that's your perspective. And, as I said at the outset of this, I titled this, Ain't I a Woman? because of Sojourner Truth. What I appreciate about you is that you have accepted that there are imperfections, but you've not let yourself decide that you don't have to address those imperfections. You've chosen to address them, not only in terms of your own life, because we all have them, but where the world tells you impossibilities, you keep fighting for the possibilities. And I think that if anyone can just find a bit of inspiration in your story, as a woman, as an executive, as a mother, as a wife, and all the other many roles you take on, it's that what you just said is truly resonant in your spirit and your example. And I want to ask you one more question before we wrap up here, which is, as you look ahead, professionally and personally, because they go hand in hand, what gives you hope in terms of the ongoing efforts you're making in this work, in this drive to make it better? What's giving you hope right now?
The thing that's giving me hope is that I'm seeing a lot of executives that look like me that are just breaking through that glass, and they are occupying some of the biggest board seats and some of the biggest positions in corporate America, and they're killing it. And, I think about Roz Brewer. She was my manager at Starbucks. She was the chief operating officer at the time. She is now the global CEO of Walgreens. A $137 billion organization that is a Fortune 10. The only Black woman to ever break through the glass in such a magnificent way. You look at women like Melody Hobson, who is the chair of the board of Starbucks, a Fortune 200. This is what gives me hope. This is what makes me recognize that there are people that look just like me. The Sunda Duckett, CEO of TIAA. She's my sorority sister. Looks just like me. And breaking through that glass. So this is what makes me recognize that if I continue to be a voice and I push and I attack the glass the way that I need to, that there will be room for others to demonstrate what they are capable of doing, which is being exceptional.
That's awesome. And Zing, you and all the women and all the multitudes more who fit that description that you just provided. They give me hope because it is challenging sometimes to have hope in the human condition, but you look for people who can be inspirations to you, even if you aren't directly connected to them, and say if they're still finding a way of doing it, maybe there's something I can continue to do as well. And I know for me, that becomes my mantra on a daily basis. So my thanks, my congratulations, and as you said, girl, you killing it. So keep at it, and know that there are many who are inspired by your example. Thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you, Charles. It has been my pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the PooleProof Wisdom Podcast. We always enjoy the company. Be sure to listen, like, subscribe, and share using Google and Apple Podcasts, Audible, Spotify, Anchor, Overcast, YouTube, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this episode, we'd appreciate it very much if you simply tell a friend about the podcast too. Spread the word. Until next time, keep on living.